At this point, Byrnes shifts gears to talk about some distinctive contributions that African American thought might make to environmentalism. And Schrader-Frechette already noted that because of the Patsy Oliver case and some of the other early environmental justice cases, we can describe environmental justice as a movement that was founded by African Americans. And this movement may, Byrnes suggests, somehow have a basis in the experience, the kind of cultural memory, or the collective experience. Cultural memory is kind of a tricky concept because it's not that it's not that African Americans today directly have an experience of slavery, but it's that the experience of slavery for African Americans as a people or as a community or as a group with a perceived common identity and history is one that has affected thinking that comes from African Americans. And so that kind of experience of slavery, Byrnes wants to suggest, may have had some implications. So one of these is that slaves may have had an especially close connection to the land. They had to work the land. And so that kind of detailed knowledge of the land and interaction with the land may have led to environmentalism and a concern for the environment being a particularly strong feature within African American experience and thought. Another set of ideas that Byrnes takes up comes from this author Smith, who asks a provocative question: is it even possible for an enslaved people to develop an authentic relationship with the land? So you think about Leopold describing a land ethics and kind of celebrating the land as a thing that could be a foundation of an ethics, or the kind of rallying point of an ethics. But for an enslaved people, or if people have been enslaved, then they may have a much more troubled relationship with the land. As Smith puts it, slavery may have made it psychologically difficult to appreciate the beauty and order of nature, or to see in it evidence of God's benevolence. So I think what that reveals is that maybe the kind of idealization of nature from someone like Leopold is missing this kind of darker component of nature, that nature could be a source of suffering, that nature could be something that one was related to in the mode of a kind of oppression, and that is going to miss things about nature and about the human relationship to nature, which may be part of why Leopold doesn't articulate any kind of idea that could be described as environmental justice. So this idea of a kind of moral significance of the land, that as Smith puts it, nature is not independent of human society. Both its physical integrity and its moral meaning are deeply intertwined with and dependent on humans' moral decisions. This again may be something that African Americans, a perspective that African Americans are particularly able to access because of this cultural memory of slavery. Now, this thesis that maybe the distinct African American experience produces distinct knowledge, in this case, a distinct knowledge about the kind of the connection between social justice and environmental concerns, is interestingly comparable to two very famous ideas. One from the African American theorist W.E.B. Du Bois, who's mentioned in this essay, but not this particular idea from Du Bois. Du Bois famously articulated the idea that African Americans have a double consciousness, which gives them a special kind of insight. The idea here is that African Americans can both see the world and society from the official dominant society perspective, the quote-unquote white perspective, because that perspective is sort of broadcast everywhere and it's impossible not to be able to see things that way. because it's just sort of, it's presented everywhere on the news and textbooks, et cetera, et cetera. So African Americans are certainly taught, one might say indoctrinated, into seeing the world from that kind of pro-white perspective. But they also can see the world from their own African American perspective, that is, from the perspective of a subjugated or dominated people, and a people subjugated or dominated in the particular ways associated with anti-Black racism in the United States. And so that double consciousness of an oppressed people gives them certain insight into the structures of society that non-oppressed people, or people who aren't oppressed in those ways, won't have. Likewise, in the 1970s, there was a debate in feminism about something called standpoint theory, which was basically the theory that maybe women, because of their particular standpoint as an oppressed sex or an oppressed gender, would be able to see things about reality, see things about knowledge, about various topics of discussion and debate that men wouldn't be able to see, because women are coming from this distinctive vantage point. Now, I think these ideas are fairly common in our discussions today. I mean, we're pretty open-minded, I think, about the idea that someone having an experience of a certain kind is very relevant to the kind of knowledge that they can have, and it's relevant to the kind of knowledge that others can be said not to have, or that's hard for others to access. So like the experience of being a trans woman or a trans man is arguably something that's very hard for those who are not trans to be able to access. Likewise, the experience of being Black in America is something that's very hard for people who are not Black in America to experience. And that idea is now being sort of leveraged in this argument from Byrnes in regard to environmental matters. Another idea, this one is drawn directly from Du Bois, by Smith, and then Byrnes is reporting on what Smith is saying about it, is that maybe property is a prerequisite of being able to be rightly related, or being able to be ethically related to the environment. So because Black Americans have traditionally been excluded from property relations with nature, they may be able to recognize the importance of property relations with nature in a way that the kind of standard environmentalism misses, what's called here progressive environmentalism. So Smith writes that the Black tradition also differs from progressive environmentalism in its concern with private space and private property. It highlights the importance of property and other civil rights to achieving this capacity for individual and collective stewardship. So I think the suggestion here is this kind of paradoxical in a way. Someone like Leopold or the deep ecologists can conceive of us all turning over our property and enjoying nature collectively, or having nature be something that's, that's not just our property. But for African Americans coming out of this African American experience of being deprived of property through slavery and other kinds of discrimination, then it may seem like that's a mistake. There isn't the same impulse to turn nature from property into non-property, or give up property, because there's an experience of already not having that as property. So there's maybe a recognition of the importance of property in conjunction with environmental concerns. And the last idea is that it comes from Alain Locke, is that in some sense, African Americans may be the most authentic American people, or folk, you can call it. And the way that the concept of folk was traditionally thought of in the early 20th century, when Locke argued this, it was thought of as people that are closer to nature. So you can see a parallel here with what Plumwood has to say about the association of women and nature. Here the suggestion is that maybe African Americans are closer to nature than other groups, or than whites are in America. And this idea is a bit problematic, or could potentially be problematic, because it might seem, again, like it's a kind of essentializing, that it's saying that blacks or African Americans have to be a certain way somehow because of their biology. But that's not what Alain Locke actually meant. He ends up saying that that what's important here is that there's a particularly strong experience, a particularly challenging experience that, and excuse me, a particularly intense collective experience associated with slavery that has made Black Americans into a people. And this process of making a group of people into a people is something that arguably only comes about through some kind of collective struggle. And so because whites haven't had to undergo the same kind of collective struggle that African Americans have had to in America, that, whites have had their disagreements with each other, their various projects, but there hasn't been a kind of need to band together as an identity in opposition to some threat. Whereas for African Americans, that's been the situation. It's kind of constant condition of being under threat, of being oppressed, discriminated against, and so on. And that struggle, that challenge, has led to the kind of formation of an identity, the formation of a people. And if you think, just to speak a little bit more, I don't know if you guys will find this idea convincing, and it's okay to disagree with it. But I mean, just to speak a little bit more in its favor, if you think about African American culture, you think about African American art and music, and how original those things are, not just in America, but worldwide, and how influential they've been. I mean, even like white American music, like rock and roll and so on, has its roots in Black music. And that's just the history. I mean, that's indisputable. And so I think that there is some insight in this idea that, in a way, the true American story is not the story of white Americans, and it's not even the story of all Americans. That in a way, the true American story, the deepest American story, the one that's the most American. I'm not saying that necessarily that you guys will agree with this, but it's just something to think about. That in a way, like, the most deeply original American story is the story of African Americans. So that's something to think about anyway.